Most folks in Cedar Valley still talk about the day the widow's basket got not a single bid. It happened on a warm summer afternoon when the sun hung low over the dusty fairgrounds and the air smelled of horses, cornbread, and pine smoke drifting in from the hills. People had come from every direction for the annual harvest auction, a place where ranchers, farmers, and travelers gathered to trade goods, meet new faces, and test their luck. The crowd was loud, lively, and full of eager hands ready to lift and wave at the auctioneer. Yet when the widow stepped forward carrying her hand-woven basket, the place went strangely silent. She held it close to her chest as if it carried the last piece of her dignity. Folks murmured that she was unlucky and that bad things followed her ever since her husband passed the previous winter. Some whispered that no rancher would risk taking home anything tied to her name. Others insisted that people were simply unsure of her, a quiet woman who kept to herself, always working, always trying to survive in a town where a person could vanish under their own sorrows. Her basket was fine work, though. It had a sturdy weave, bright colors from natural dyes she made herself, and a smooth handle shaped with care. Anyone with an honest eye could tell it was worth far more than most things being bid on that day. But still, no one raised a hand. The auctioneer cleared his throat and tried again. He lifted the basket high, pointing out the craft, the detail, the time spent. He spoke of frontier women who put their heart into their work, the kind of effort that built homes and held families together. Still nothing. The widow stared down at her shoes, feeling the weight of the crowd pressing on her. She wished the ground would swallow her whole. She had come with hope, thinking maybe someone would give a fair price, maybe enough to buy grain or cloth for the cold season ahead. Instead, she stood there alone, the whispers growing. The crowd wasn't cruel, only cautious. Life in the old American frontier was hard, and people feared anything that seemed cursed, even if they never said the word out loud. The widow could feel the distance settling between her and the others. She felt like a shadow among them, present but unseen, standing in plain daylight yet treated as if she carried some misfortune the town wanted to avoid. She knew the rumors, knew how easily frontier stories grew larger than truth, especially when folks needed someone to blame for things they didn't understand. Just when the auctioneer began lowering the basket, ready to move on, a calm voice rose from the edge of the crowd. It came from a tall Apache rancher who had been standing near the corral, silent and observant. He had arrived early that morning with a wagon full of livestock and woven blankets, trading with a few settlers and minding his own business. His presence drew the usual curious glances, but no one bothered him. He carried himself with steady confidence, the kind that didn't need to be loud to be respected. His long dark hair fell past his shoulders, tied loosely at the back. His hands were rough from ranch work, and his eyes held the depth of someone who had known both loss and strength. He stepped forward, boots striking the ground with purpose, and the crowd parted without being asked. People watched him closely, unsure of what he intended. The widow lifted her head, startled to see him approaching. She recognized him from a distance, but had never spoken to him. She had seen him riding along the ridge near her cabin, checking fences or guiding cattle. He was known for working a large stretch of land with his extended family, raising horses and keeping peace with settlers when many others struggled to do the same. The rancher stopped in front of the auctioneer, glanced at the basket, then looked at the widow. His gaze wasn't pitying. It wasn't curious either. It was steady, as if he saw something in her no one else cared to notice. The auctioneer blinked, unsure if this man had stepped forward to ask a question or make a bid. Before anyone could speak, the rancher said he would pay triple for the basket. His voice carried so clearly that even the folks at the far end of the fairgrounds turned to stare. Triple, not double, not a modest offer, but triple the starting price. The widow's heart jumped so fiercely she nearly dropped the basket. The auctioneer almost stumbled backward, surprised by the boldness of the bid. Murmurs scattered through the crowd like wind among dry grass. People shifted in place, glancing at one another, wondering why a man like him would pay so much for something everyone else avoided. Some whispered it made no sense. Others wondered if he knew something they didn't. The widow felt her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to thank him, but the words stuck. She had never met anyone who would make such an offer for her work, let alone stand for her in front of a crowd that had just turned their backs. She studied his expression, searching for the reason behind his generosity. There was no mockery, no challenge. Only calm sincerity. The auctioneer, eager to recover from the shock, struck his gavel and declared the basket sold. The sound echoed across the fairgrounds, but the moment felt strangely quiet. The rancher reached for the basket, and the widow carefully placed it into his hands. When their fingers brushed, she felt a warmth she hadn't known in a long time, something like safety. Something like someone finally seeing her worth rather than her misfortune. She thanked him in a soft voice. But before he could reply, a gust of wind swept across the open field, carrying dust and the distant cry of horses. It was the kind of wind that signaled change in Cedar Valley, though no one ever said it outright. The rancher nodded to her, then turned as if ready to leave, but something held him in place. He seemed to study her again, as if rethinking whether to speak or walk away. Just then, a loud clatter broke the moment. A horse reared at the far end of the grounds, sending a cart tipping sideways. People rushed toward the noise, and the widow turned instinctively to see what happened. In the confusion, she noticed something else. A man near the general store was watching her with a cold stare she didn't recognize. He wore a hat pulled low, and when their eyes met, he stepped back into the shadows between two wagons. Something about his presence sent a strange chill through her. When she turned back toward the rancher, he was still there, watching the same direction she had looked. His jaw tightened slightly, as if he too sensed something was off. He took a small step closer to her, lowering his voice. He asked if she knew the man who had been staring at her. She shook her head, but the question unsettled her. She tried to dismiss the feeling, thinking maybe it was nothing. Maybe the man was only passing through. Yet deep down, she felt something shifting, something she couldn't explain. The rancher seemed to feel it too. Before she could speak again, he told her to be careful on her way home. There was a weight behind his words, and it made her pulse quicken. She asked him why, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced once more toward the shadowed space between the wagons. As if checking whether the stranger was still there, he turned back to her, ready to say something he clearly felt she needed to hear, but at that very moment, the auctioneer called out for everyone to gather again, announcing the next item. The noise swelled, the crowd pushed in, and the rancher stepped back as people moved between them. She reached out slightly, wanting to ask what he meant. Wanting to know why his tone carried such warning, he opened his mouth to speak. But the noise drowned out his words, and whatever he intended to tell her stayed unspoken. The crowd thickened around them as the auctioneer lifted another item and called for attention. The noise rose again, carrying laughter, shouts, and the rattle of coins. The widow tried to keep her eyes on the Apache rancher, but people pressed between them, blocking her sight. She caught a glimpse of his dark hair as he turned toward the edge of the crowd, moving with purpose, as if he had somewhere he needed to be or something he needed to check. She wanted to ask him what he had been trying to say, but he disappeared behind a line of wagons before she could take a step. She stood there for a long moment, clutching the empty space where her basket had been. The warmth she felt when he had taken it was still lingering in her hands. The offer he made continued echoing in her chest. Triple, not because he had to, not because anyone else was bidding, but because he wanted to do it. She had lived long enough among settlers to know when someone acted out of kindness versus obligation. This felt different, like he had seen something in her work that others refused to see, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the stranger near the general store. She didn't know why his stare bothered her so deeply. Maybe the rancher had sensed the same thing, which explained the warning in his voice. The old frontier had a way of hiding danger behind friendly smiles, and Cedar Valley, though peaceful on most days, had its share of people who carried secrets. She wondered if the man was passing through or if he had been watching her for some time. She shook the thought from her mind and started walking toward the edge of the fairgrounds. She needed to head home before the sky began to darken. Her cabin sat half a mile from town, past the cottonwoods and along the creek that marked the edge of her small property. She had built a life there with her late husband, a simple one, filled with hard work and quiet evenings by the fire. Losing him had changed everything. The loneliness settled into her bones like the cold in winter. The townsfolk tried to be polite, but she felt herself fading into the background more and more. With the coins from the basket sale, she planned to buy a sack of flour and a few supplies she had been waiting on. It wasn't much, but enough to make a small difference for the coming season. She made her way to the trading post, forcing herself not to glance back at the auction or search for the rancher in the crowd. Inside the store, the warm smell of leather, spices, and old wood greeted her. The shopkeeper nodded to her with a quiet smile. She placed the coins on the counter, trying to ignore the way her heart still raced. He didn't ask about the auction. He simply gathered the items she needed and wrapped them in cloth. He had always treated her kindly, even when others kept their distance. That was a small comfort. When she stepped back outside, she noticed hoof prints in the dirt. They didn't belong to a workhorse or one used for plowing. The prints were sharp and clean, likely from a fast riding horse. They led away from the general store and toward the road that crossed the valley. She didn't know why she stared at them so long. Maybe she was imagining things, but the prints seemed fresher than the others scattered across the ground. She glanced around, trying to decide whether to follow the main road or cut through the short trail that led behind the barns. The main road was open and busy, but the trail was quieter, lined with trees and shaded paths where she felt a sense of calm. After the long morning, she wanted peace. Even if only for a short walk, she shifted her supplies and headed toward the trail. The air cooled as she stepped under the trees, their leaves rustling gently overhead. A few birds sang from nearby branches. The sound eased her nerves, and before long she found her shoulders relaxing. As she walked, she thought about the rancher again. She realized she didn't even know his name. People referred to him simply as the Apache rancher, a man who kept to himself and rarely stayed long in town. She wondered what had brought him to the auction that day, or what had driven him to bid so boldly. Word around the valley said his land stretched far toward the hills, where the grass stayed green longer than the rest of the frontier. Some settlers admired the way he ran his ranch with fairness and honor. Others were wary, unsure of how to approach a man caught between two worlds, living by the traditions of his people while working alongside settlers who didn't always understand or accept him. But no one questioned his skill. His horses were known to be strong, loyal, and well-trained. He had traded several at the last market, all for high prices that he never bragged about. The deeper she walked into the shaded trail, the more she replayed his warning in her mind. Be careful on your way home. The way he said it carried weight she couldn't shake. It wasn't casual advice. It was a warning from someone who trusted his instincts. She tried to tell herself she was being silly. Frontier life always came with dangers, but she knew the roads, the woods, the familiar turns of the land she called home. Halfway down the trail, she heard something move behind her. It was soft, barely noticeable, like a twig snapping or a boot brushing against dry leaves. She stopped, turning slowly, but the path behind her was empty. Only the wind stirred the leaves. She continued walking, slower now, her senses sharper. She held her supplies closer and listened. When she reached the small footbridge over the creek, she paused. The water below moved gently, reflecting light in broken pieces. She placed a hand on the railing, taking a breath before crossing. The sound behind her came again, closer this time. She turned faster than before, heart pounding, but once again saw nothing. She crossed the bridge and quickened her pace until the trees thinned and the sunlight returned in full. The sight of open fields eased some of her fear. In the distance, she could see her cabin, smoke rising from the chimney where she had left a small fire burning earlier. Relief settled over her like a warm blanket. She didn't know why she felt watched, but she was home now. Home had always been her safest place, but the moment she approached the front porch, she stopped. Her door was slightly open. Not wide, just enough to notice if someone had been inside. She felt the ground shift under her feet. She had been sure she closed it before leaving. She stood perfectly still, Unsure if she should step forward or turn back toward town, she swallowed hard, telling herself it could have been the wind or a loose hinge. But something inside her refused to accept that explanation. Something told her she wasn't imagining any of it. She set her supplies down quietly and stepped toward the door, testing the porch boards beneath her. She pushed the door open with her fingertips, ready to run if needed. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. Her small table was untouched. The blankets were folded. The fire had burned low but still glowed faintly. Nothing looked out of place. Yet she felt the presence of someone who had stood inside only moments earlier. She stepped in slowly, her breath thin, her heart beating hard against her chest. When she reached the center of the room, she froze. On the table lay a thin strip of leather. It hadn't been there before. She picked it up with trembling hands. It was cut clean, smooth on one end and frayed on the other. She didn't recognize it. It wasn't hers. Someone had left it there, placed gently as if to be found. She stared at it, turning it in her hand, trying to understand what it meant. She didn't hear the soft crunch of footsteps outside until it was too late. Her body tensed. She moved toward the doorway in fear and confusion, but when she stepped outside, she found no one. Only the wind sweeping over the field and the fading sound of a horse in the distance. She clutched the strip of leather to her chest, realizing she wasn't imagining the danger at all. Someone had been watching her. Someone had stepped inside her home. And someone had left a message she didn't yet understand, far down the road, almost hidden by the sun's glare. She glimpsed a lone rider moving away from her cabin. She couldn't tell who it was, but something told her. This wasn't the end of trouble, it was only the beginning. That night, the widow barely slept. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, and every creak of old wood made her flinch. The strip of leather lay on the table beside the oil lamp, a small, harmless thing at first glance, yet it felt heavier than a sack of stones. She watched its shadow flicker on the wall and wondered who had placed it there and why they had chosen her. In the old American frontier, nothing was left without a reason. Messages were rarely written on paper. They came in the shape of tracks, marks, and quiet gestures that carried more meaning than words. She sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit field. The road was empty now, the lone rider long gone. Cattle moved in the distance, dark shapes against the grass. She wrapped a shawl tighter around her shoulders, thinking of the Apache rancher and the way his eyes had sharpened at the fairgrounds when he thought she was being watched. He had seen danger quicker than she had. That truth unsettled her. Out here, being a step slow could cost a person everything. By morning, the sky turned pale and the chill of dawn settled over the valley. She forced herself to move as she always did, starting the fire, grinding what little grain she had left, feeding the chickens and checking the small garden behind the cabin. Routine steadied her. But even as she worked, her gaze kept drifting back to the strip of leather. Its presence twisted her thoughts, pulling her away from the simple rhythm of frontier life. Around midday, she finally slipped it into her pocket and headed toward town. She needed more than guesses. She needed to know whether others had seen such a sign. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. The path to Cedar Valley felt different that day. The breeze carried sounds from the settlement, the distant ring of a hammer from the blacksmith and the chatter from the trading post. But under those familiar noises, she sensed something tight and uneasy, as if the whole valley held its breath. At the edge of town, she noticed groups of men standing closer together than usual, their voices low. A few glanced her way, then looked off quickly, as if they feared being caught staring. She stepped up onto the wooden walkway and headed toward the general store, only to stop when she saw the sheriff speaking quietly with the auctioneer near the corral. The sheriff's hat was tilted forward, shielding his eyes, but she could see the hard line of his mouth. She debated walking over, then decided against it. She had never had trouble with the law, and she did not want to explain signs she barely understood herself. Instead, she slipped into the trading post. The shopkeeper greeted her with that same gentle nod, but even he seemed distracted. His eyes flicked to the window more often than usual. She placed a small list of items on the counter and waited. As he gathered them, she toyed with the strip of leather in her pocket, fingers rubbing the edges until she finally found the courage to pull it out. She placed it on the counter. The shopkeeper paused, his hand stilled over a stack of tins. He looked at the leather, then at her, the question clear in his eyes. She asked if he had seen anything like it before. He picked it up slowly, turning it between his fingers. After a moment, he said it looked like it had been cut from a bridle or a saddle strap, something belonging to a good riding horse rather than a plow animal. The cut was clean on one side, torn on the other. He said it might be nothing more than a broken piece. Someone tossed aside. She told him it had been left on her table. That changed his face. His jaw tightened. He asked if anyone had been near her property lately, anyone she didn't recognize. She told him about the strange man at the auction and the feeling of being followed on the trail. She told him about the door standing open and the rider she saw leaving in the distance. The shopkeeper listened carefully, then set the strip of leather down and leaned closer. He said there had been talk of a drifter in the area, someone asking quiet questions about land, widows, and unpaid debts. No one had seen him clearly, only heard pieces of conversation in the saloon and near the livery. Some said he worked for men in another town who believed certain properties in Cedar Valley were easy to claim. If their owners were frightened enough or driven to leave, the widow felt a cold shiver move along her spine. Her land might be small, but it sat near good water and fertile soil. It was the kind of place someone with power and money might want, especially if they thought its owner had no one to stand beside her. The shopkeeper hesitated, then told her something else. The night before the auction, the Apache rancher had come in with a few supplies. He had asked if anyone new had arrived in town, anyone who seemed too curious about the widow living alone on the edge of the valley. The shopkeeper had told him about a stranger who paid more attention to the notice board and land maps than to the prices on grain. The rancher had listened, his expression unreadable, then left without buying much. Now, after what she had just shared, it no longer seemed like a coincidence. The widow thanked the shopkeeper and gathered her parcels. As she stepped outside, her eyes scanned the street without meaning to. The saloon doors swung open and a group of men came out laughing. None of them were the stranger she remembered. Near the livery, a few horses stood tied, heads low, reins hanging loose. She studied the saddles, the bridles, the leather straps, wondering which one might show a missing piece. On the far side of the street, near the corral, she saw him. The Apache rancher stood beside his horse, tightening the cinch. The sun caught the lines of his face and the strength in his posture. He looked like he belonged out on the open plains, not squeezed between buildings and fences. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up. Their eyes met, and she felt something steady beneath the fear. A reminder that not everyone in this valley wished her harm. She crossed the street, clutching the strip of leather again. When she reached him, he greeted her with a simple nod, neither formal nor distant. She thanked him for buying her basket and tried to keep her voice even. He told her it was honest work and worth more than most people understood. His tone made her feel seen in a way that unsettled and comforted her at the same time. She showed him the leather piece. The change in his expression was subtle but real. His eyes narrowed just a fraction. He turned the strip in his hand, studying the cut and the worn edges. After a quiet moment, he said it was not just any leather. It bore a faint mark, almost rubbed away, like a brand or symbol pressed near one end. To most people, it would look like nothing, but he recognized the shape. It reminded him of a mark used by a certain group of riders who had caused trouble near the border some seasons back. Men who worked for whoever paid them to scare small ranchers and lonely settlers off land. The widow felt the ground tilt again. He asked where she had found it. When she told him it was left on her table, he looked toward the road that led to her place. There was no drama in his face, only a serious calculation, as if he were measuring distance, time, and risk all at once. He told her plainly that she was not safe alone if those men had taken an interest in her property. She asked why they would care about a small widow's land when there were larger ranches around. He answered that some men did not need a reason beyond chance. Once they chose a target, they rarely turned away until they had taken what they wanted. Sometimes it was land. Sometimes it was livestock. Sometimes it was control. He paused, then asked if she had any family nearby, anyone who might stay with her for a while. She shook her head. Her nearest relatives were far away, and most of the townsfolk had families of their own. She could not bring herself to ask anyone to share her danger, especially when some already viewed her as a source of misfortune. The rancher thought for a moment, then said there was another option. His family's ranch was further out, past a line of rocky hills where the land opened again to grass and clear water. They kept watch there and did not fear riders with half-hidden symbols on their saddles. He could send one of his younger cousins to keep an eye on her cabin, or she could come stay on their land for a short time until things settled. He did not press her, only laid the choice in front of her like a path she might or might not walk. She hesitated. The idea of leaving her cabin cut deep. It was all she had left of her husband, of the life they built together. Yet the thought of staying alone while unknown riders circled the valley filled her with a different kind of pain. Pride and fear pulled her in opposite directions. Before she could decide, another voice entered the mix. The sheriff approached, his boots scuffing the dust, his eyes sharp. He greeted the rancher with a short nod and the widow with a more formal one. He said there had been reports of fresh tracks near several smaller homesteads, all belonging to a fast rider who did not stop to talk. A few folks had mentioned seeing a man with a hat pulled low, never staying in one place long. The sheriff admitted he did not like the feel of it. He eyed the leather strip in the rancher's hand and asked where it came from. The rancher gave a careful answer, saying only that it had been found where it did not belong. The sheriff seemed to understand there was more being unsaid. He took note of the faint mark on the leather and said he would watch the road more closely. The widow realized something in that moment. Her troubles were no longer hidden, whether she liked it or not. The attention of men with authority and men with quiet power was now fixed on her small corner of the valley. That brought some comfort, but it also brought new risk. Once her situation became known, there was less room to ignore it. The sheriff left to continue his rounds, promising to ride past her cabin before nightfall. The rancher did not move immediately. He looked at her with an expression she could not easily read. He told her that people might whisper about her being unlucky, but luck had little to do with what was happening now. This was about greed and fear, and about whether the people of Cedar Valley would stand by and let someone be slowly pushed out of the life they had fought to build. She felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent so long trying not to bother anyone, trying not to appear needy or troublesome, that she did not know how to accept help when it arrived. Yet she could see in his eyes that this was not pity. It was the clear decision of a man who believed some things were worth defending. He said he would ride by her, place before sundown to look at the tracks for himself. If he found signs that certain riders had been there, he would not ignore it. Out on the frontier, small warnings often pointed toward larger storms. It was better to face them early than wait until they broke over the roof. She nodded, unsure what else to say. When he mounted his horse and rode off, she watched him until he disappeared beyond the last building. The town felt different after he left, like the sky before a summer storm. Charged and waiting Daz, she walked back toward home, carrying her supplies and the weight of new knowledge. She could not shake the feeling that lines were being drawn around her. The valley she once knew as quiet and familiar now hid questions at every turn. Somewhere beyond the hills and along the winding roads, riders with unknown marks on their saddles moved with a purpose that included her. She had no way of knowing. Yet that the strip of leather, the stranger's stare, and the Apache rancher's bold bid at the auction were all pieces of the same struggle, but the pull of those threads was tightening, and each step she took toward her cabin drew her closer to the heart of a conflict that would test not only her courage, but the true character of Cedar Valley and the man who had paid triple to show her she was worth more than the stories whispered behind her back. The widow walked home slowly, the weight of the leather strip in her pocket heavier than all the supplies she carried. Each step along the dusty road echoed with new fear and unanswered questions. The sun had begun dropping toward the horizon, softening the landscape with warm orange light that usually comforted her. But today the shadows beneath the cottonwoods looked deeper, and the open field around her cabin seemed too exposed. She kept glancing over her shoulder, searching the road for any sign of the Apache rancher or the sheriff. Yet the valley remained silent. When she reached the porch, she paused. Her door was still closed this time, but the memory of finding it open the day before sent a shiver through her. She took a steadying breath, turned the knob, and stepped inside. Everything looked as she left it, but she scanned the room carefully, her senses sharp. Only when she was certain that no one had entered did she set her parcels down. As she worked, preparing a small supper and tending the fire, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls around her were thinner now, as if danger could seep through them like cold wind. The rancher had said he would come before sundown to look at the tracks, but the sky outside was already growing violet. She moved toward the window, peering out across the empty field. She knew better than to panic, but something about the stillness told her the night would not pass quietly. Minutes felt like hours until finally she heard the distant rhythm of hooves. Relief swept through her when she saw him riding toward her cabin. He dismounted with ease, tied his horse, and approached the porch with a calm stride. She stepped outside, wanting to meet him rather than wait inside the shadows. He greeted her in his quiet way, and asked if she had seen anything unusual since leaving town. She told him she hadn't, though her nerves said otherwise. He walked the perimeter of the cabin, crouching often to study the dirt. His focus was sharp, his movements practiced. After a while, he returned to her with a thoughtful, guarded expression. He said that new tracks circled her cabin, fresh ones from a single fast horse. The prints was similar to the ones near town. Whoever rode that horse had stayed close, likely watching to see whether she returned alone. The rider had not approached the door today, but the pattern told him something dangerous. The stranger wasn't passing through. He was waiting for the right moment. The widow's stomach tightened. She asked what the rider might want, though she knew the general idea. The rancher didn't soften his answer. He said some men liked to take land from those who lived alone, especially widows who had no one to speak for them. Scaring her would be the first step. If that didn't work, they might push harder. His voice was even, but the weight behind his words left no room for doubt. She felt herself trembling slightly. She didn't want him to see her fear, but she couldn't hide it. He stepped closer, his tone gentler as he said she wasn't weak, and the danger wasn't her fault. The frontier was full of men who preyed on silence and solitude. Facing them didn't make her unlucky. It made her brave. She took a slow breath, surprised by how steady his words felt. She told him she didn't want to leave her cabin, not unless she had no choice. He nodded, saying he understood. He told her there were ways to make her property less inviting to those who wished her harm. A few simple signs could let unfriendly riders know she wasn't alone, that someone strong was watching before she could ask what he meant. He walked back to his horse and returned with a carved wooden stake. At the top of it was a symbol burned into the wood, an Apache mark that meant protection and warning. He said that riders who had caused trouble before would recognize it. It wouldn't scare everyone, but it would make some think twice. She watched as he drove the stake into the ground near her porch. The sound of wood hitting earth echoed through the quiet field. When he stood up again, she felt as if a small circle of safety had been drawn around her home. The sun had nearly set, and the air grew colder. She invited him inside for coffee, feeling it was the least she could offer. He accepted, stepping into the cabin with the calm respect of someone entering sacred ground. Inside, he looked around quietly, his eyes lingering on the small details that made the place hers. The knitted blanket on the rocking chair, the books stacked by the hearth, the dried herbs hanging above the stove. He didn't judge her for the modesty of her home. Instead, he seemed to understand how much it meant to her. As she poured the coffee, she asked about his ranch. She knew little about his family or the land he worked, and something inside her wanted to understand him better. He told her that his people had lived on the same stretch of land for generations. They raised horses, tended cattle, and taught their children the old ways while adapting to the changing world around them. He spoke of his brother, who had passed 2 winters ago, and how the responsibility of leading the ranch had fallen to him sooner than expected. She listened closely, feeling a connection forming between them. He spoke with honesty but not with pride. He talked of hardship and effort, of maintaining peace with settlers and protecting his land from those who wished to take it. His words were steady, humble, grounded. She realized then why he had bid triple for her basket. It wasn't pity. It was understanding. He had seen the value in her work because he knew what it meant to build something with one's own hands. As the fire crackled, he asked her about her husband. She hesitated, but he did not rush her. She told him her husband had been a quiet man, hard-working and gentle. He had died from a fever the previous winter, leaving her to manage the land alone. She tried to smile as she spoke, but grief trembled at the edges of her voice. He didn't offer hollow comfort. Instead, he said her husband must have been proud to share a home with a woman who could carry so much weight on her shoulders. Something in the way he said it softened the ache in her chest. The cabin felt warmer then, not just from the fire, but from the presence of someone who understood the silent battles she fought every day. Still, the threat lingering outside the walls wasn't gone. It hovered between them, pressing into the edges of the night. He stood to leave while there was still a sliver of daylight. He said riding back across the valley in full darkness wasn't wise. But before stepping out the door, he turned to her and said she must not open the door for anyone after dark, not even if they called her name. Riders who wanted to trick their way inside sometimes used voices or tried to sound friendly. She nodded, promising she would stay cautious. He paused one more time, his gaze deep with something she couldn't yet name. Then he rode away, disappearing into the growing darkness. The night stretched long after he left. She sat near the window again, watching the road. The wind picked up, rustling the grass in strange patterns. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. She tried to convince herself that nothing would happen, that the rider wouldn't return so soon, but as the moon rose higher, she heard the faint thud of hooves. Slow, deliberate, she blew out her lamp so the cabin fell into darkness. Her heartbeat thumped in her ears. She crept to the window, peering through a narrow crack in the shutter. A lone rider sat in the field, not moving. Not approaching. Just watching her cabin. His hat was pulled low, the same shape she had seen at the auction. Even in the dim light, she recognized the curve of his shoulders and the unnatural stillness of his posture. He lifted something from his saddle, something slender and long. She held her breath, unable to look away. Then he leaned forward, his horse shifting beneath him, and he began riding slowly toward her porch. The widow stepped back, pressing her hand to her mouth to keep from gasping. She didn't know what he carried. She didn't know what he wanted tonight. But she knew he was bold enough to come again. Even after seeing the rancher's protective mark in her yard, she looked toward the road, silently praying for help, for a miracle, for anything. Then, in the distance behind the stranger, she saw a second horse's silhouette. Moving fast, riding harder than the night air itself. And for the first time, she didn't feel quite so alone. The widow held her breath as the two riders stood in the moonlit field. The first man approached with deliberate slowness, his dark silhouette cutting through the quiet night. The second one moved fast, the rhythm of his horse matching the urgency in the air. Though she could not yet see his face, she knew in her heart who it was. Something in the way he rode, the strength in his posture, the purpose behind each stride, told her the Apache rancher had come. The stranger on the first horse reached the edge of her yard. His presence felt colder up close, more threatening than before. He carried a long piece of rope in one hand, looped and ready. She stepped back from the window, her heartbeat pounding, but she refused to crumble. She had spent months surviving grief and hardship. She had rebuilt her life in small, quiet ways. And now she held on to hope that help was near. The stranger's horse snorted, sensing tension in the air. The man glanced toward her porch, then turned his head sharply as the faster rider closed in. The Apache rancher arrived with a hard stop, dust rising behind him in a swirling cloud. He didn't shout or draw a weapon. He simply looked at the intruder, his calm expression holding more weight than any threat could. The stranger stiffened. The rope in his hand dropped slightly, no longer as sure. The widow watched from the window as the rancher spoke in a steady tone. She couldn't hear the words clearly, but she felt their meaning. He wasn't asking questions. He was telling the man to leave her land, now and for good, The stranger's jaw tightened. He tried to argue, pointing toward the widow's cabin with a dismissive wave, as if her land was something he deserved to claim. The rancher didn't move. He sat tall in his saddle, his shoulders squared. The moonlight shimmered against his dark hair, and his quiet strength filled the yard like a shield when the stranger reached for his rope again. The rancher leaned forward, and in that instant something changed. The stranger realized he wasn't just facing one widow alone in the dark. He was facing a man known for defending what he believed in, a man who had family, honor, and a ranch standing behind him. Men like that were not easily threatened? They did not back down. The stranger's horse shifted. After a long, tense pause, he pulled the reins sharply and turned around. He didn't look back as he galloped toward the open valley. His figure grew smaller and smaller until he disappeared beyond the ridge. Only, when the night was quiet again, did the widow step outside. Her legs felt weak, but her steps were steady. The rancher dismounted, tying his horse near the porch. In the moon's soft glow, he looked at her with concern and relief. She thanked him with a voice that trembled from the weight of the moment. He said there was no need for thanks. No one should face danger alone, especially not someone who had done nothing to earn trouble. His tone held both firmness and warmth, and she felt her fear ebb away. He told her the stranger had not acted alone. There were men in nearby towns who believed they could take land from those who didn't have strong backing. The strip of leather left on her table was meant to frighten her into giving up her home. But she had stood firm, and he intended to make sure no one else bothered her again. The widow felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not sorrow, but a quiet recognition of the support she had been given. She had lived for so long believing she carried everything on her own shoulders. Tonight proved she wasn't as isolated as she once thought. She invited him inside to rest and warm up, even though the hour was late. He accepted with a polite nod. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly, filling the small room with a warm glow. She offered him water and sat across from him at the table. Finally able to breathe again, he examined the strip of leather again, pointing out the faint symbol. It belonged to a group that rarely stayed in one place for long. They roamed between towns, looking for easy opportunities. Since he had confronted their rider, the others would likely stay away from her land. Men like that rarely sought a fight they could not win. The widow's shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. She felt lighter, as if a heavy stone had been lifted. She asked if the stranger would return. The rancher shook his head. He said the man had seen enough to know better. Out here in the old American frontier, respect carried farther than fear, and the symbol he planted outside her home would speak for her even when she slept. The widow leaned back in her chair, letting the peace of the moment settle around her. The fire reflected off the rancher's steady expression. She realized she trusted him, something she hadn't felt with another person in a long time. He looked around her cabin, noticing the small touches she had added to make it a home again. He said it was a good place, full of heart and history. She found herself smiling, embarrassed, and grateful at the same time. No one had complimented her home since her husband passed. She didn't know how much she needed to hear that it still held worth. For a while, they sat in quiet company, the kind that felt natural. He spoke of his family ranch, of the wild horses they trained and the cattle they raised. She told him about her garden, her late husband's old tools, and the struggles she faced managing the land alone. He listened with care, offering guidance where needed, but never speaking over her as the fire burned lower. He said he would return in the morning with 2 of his cousins to help reinforce her fences and survey the land for any signs of trouble. She started to protest, saying she didn't want to burden him, but he raised a hand gently and told her that helping neighbors was not a burden. It was the way of good people. The frontier was too big and too wild to face alone. She felt her eyes sting with emotion. She thanked him again, this time with a soft, steady voice. He stood to leave, saying he needed to return before his ranch grew worried about the late hour. At the door, he turned back and told her she was stronger than the world had led her to believe. She watched him mount his horse and ride away under the moonlight. The night no longer felt threatening. It felt alive with new beginnings. The next morning, she woke to the sound of hooves and soft voices outside. When she stepped onto the porch, she saw the rancher and two young men, likely his cousins, already examining her fence line. The morning sun painted the valley in warm gold, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly safe. The young men greeted her with friendly smiles and began their work with confident ease. The rancher walked toward her, stopping at the porch steps. His presence brought calm, like a steady anchor in the shifting winds of life. Together, they spent the day repairing the fence, smoothing the worn earth, and clearing the trail near her cabin. They found the stranger's old tracks, but no sign of his return. The widow worked beside them, her hands busy, her heart feeling lighter with every passing hour. By afternoon, the place looked stronger and more cared for than it had since her husband's passing. She felt a bloom of pride and relief. She asked the rancher if he thought the trouble was gone for good. He said that in frontier life nothing was certain, but he believed the danger had passed. More importantly, she wouldn't face anything alone again. The widow felt a warmth spread through her. It wasn't just safety she felt now. It was connection, support, hope. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the rancher prepared to leave. But this time, he didn't ride off right away. He lingered at the gate, looking back at her. She stepped closer. Unsure what to say, he told her she had a strong spirit and that any man who failed to see her worth had been blind. He said her basket had been a symbol of her patience, effort, and resilience, and paying triple for it had been the easiest decision he had ever made. She felt her cheeks warm. She told him she was grateful not just for his help, but for the way he believed her life held value when others doubted her. The kindness in his eyes deepened. Then he asked if he could return the next day to help mend the trail behind her cabin and check on her garden before the colder season arrived. His voice carried sincerity, not obligation. She smiled and told him he was welcome anytime. He nodded, his gaze lingering a moment longer before he finally rode away. Promising to return with the morning light, the widow stood on her porch long after he disappeared, feeling the evening breeze brush against her face. Her land was safe. Her heart was steadier. The valley felt different now, filled with possibility rather than fear. She looked toward the horizon, knowing that life had changed. She no longer lived as a shadow on the edge of Cedar Valley. She had allies, protection, friendship, and perhaps even the beginning of something deeper with the man who had paid triple for her basket and seen her worth when no one else did. The old American frontier was a hard place, but now she faced it with strength and hope. And for the first time since her husband passed, she stepped inside her cabin feeling like the story of her life wasn't ending. It was just beginning.